Welcome to Chapter 9. In this chapter, we'll discuss communication within the organizational context. Essentially, at the very basic level, the communication process is used to transmit information between a sender and a receiver and to establish shared meaning. At a very simple level, the communication process involves the sender encoding the message, selecting a communication channel through which he or she sends the message to the receiver, who decodes the message and then sends some form of response to the sender so that the sender knows that the message has been received. The encoding process can mean that I am encoding my message through video or through face-to-face communication or in the written form. There are lots of ways in which we can transmit a message. There are lots of different channels we can use. Face-to-face communication, video conference, teleconference, letter, email, text message, fax, memo. There are lots of ways in which we can communicate through different channels. The receiver then decodes the message and sends a response through the feedback loop. But the communication process, as described in this chart, is also very prone to interference, to noise, to miscommunication. And so you might want to pause the video and jot down a few ideas as to what can interfere in this communication process. What are some barriers to communication? Essentially, barriers can originate from the sender, from the channel, or from the receiver. The sender can encode the message poorly, maybe because the sender has poor communication skills or poor writing skills. Maybe the sender is intentionally distorting the message so as not to deliver bad news, because we tend to be critical of those people who deliver bad news, right? The expression shoot the messenger is because we do not like to receive bad news. And so the sender might intentionally, for the sake of self-preservation, choose to distort the message or filter out negative information to soften it, so to speak. So the way the sender encodes the message can introduce noise into the process and act as a communication barrier. Of course, the receiver's ability to correctly decode the message is also likely to create some noise in this process. If the receiver is not really listening, or if the receiver does not have the same language proficiency in the language that is used for the communication, those could act as communication barriers. And if the receiver did not receive the message appropriately, the feedback that he or she sends might be incorrect or nonsensical to the sender and act as a communication barrier and disrupt the flow of information in this process. Another important source of miscommunication is selecting the correct channel. How do we know what channel we should select? Well, the selection of the channel depends on multiple variables, and we'll look at those in a few minutes. Here are some additional potential barriers to effective communication. One, the sender might unintentionally distort the message, maybe because the sender is unintentionally not including all the necessary information. Of course, the sender can also filter, as mentioned earlier, and intentionally not communicate the entire message. So the message can be unintentionally or intentionally distorted through filtering. Semantics could also act as a barrier to communication. For example, if we use jargon or acronyms or professional language that the receiver is not familiar with, then he or she will have a challenge in deciphering or decoding the message to correctly understand it. If the receiver is defensive, he or she might also not correctly receive the message. Because of course, when we are defensive, we are not really listening, but rather our mind is working at a comeback, and we're not really listening to what the sender is saying. And so the communication process can be disrupted when one of the parties feels that they are being attacked and feels defensive. Of course, language proficiency can act as a communication barrier when people are not proficient in a particular language, the language that is used for communication, or if they have very heavily accented speech, that can reduce their ability to appropriately encode the message or reduce the receiver's ability to correctly decode the message. And this can happen when we speak the same language. This is not necessarily a barrier just when communicating in different languages, but for example, the American version of English is very different from the British version of English. The Spanish, Castilian Spanish, is different from the Spanish spoken in Mexico and other Latin American countries. And so this can also act as a communication barrier. Even if we are both speaking the same language and speak it fluently, we might speak different versions of that language, so to speak. So the barriers to effective communication can come from different areas. Of course, cultural barriers can also play a role here. For example, in many Asian cultures, the norm is to avoid direct eye contact as a sign of respect. And so if I'm communicating with someone from an Asian society and I'm unaware of this cultural norm, I might suspect that my counterpart is being dishonest or hiding something because he or she is avoiding direct eye contact. And so the message received might be tainted by the nonverbals that I do not understand as a result of a cultural barrier. Another important cultural barrier is the poor selection of channel. And so this leads to the question of what kinds of channels can we use and how should we select the appropriate channel. Interpersonal communication includes a rational message and an emotional message. The rational message is communicated through the words that we speak. The emotional message, the emotional part of the message, is communicated through our tone of voice, facial expressions, nonverbals, right? The body language, the hand gestures, the posture. All of these variables will communicate the emotional message. So the content of our message is the rational part, but the tone of voice, the empathy is communicating the emotional part of the message. And so the richer the channel we choose, the higher the richness of the communication channel that we use, the more likely it is that we will be able to communicate both the rational and the emotional components of the message. The richest form of communication is face-to-face communication, where I can hear the words and see all the nonverbals, the tone of voice, the body language, the eye contact, the facial expressions, the hand gestures, the posture, all of those nonverbals that communicate meaning. So the richest form of communication is face-to-face communication. It would be at the top of the chart. Video conferencing like Zoom, like FaceTime, try to mimic that rich channel of communication and come pretty close. Then as we descend down in the level of richness, we are likely to have phone conversation, voice conversations, or voice conference calls. Those are lower in richness. We can still have the tone of voice, but we will not see all the nonverbals. And as we go down in richness, we have letters, emails, fax, memos, newsletters, text messages. all of those are in declining richness compared to face-to-face communications. This is why we use emojis so often to complement the lack of the emotional component when we communicate in the written form. So how do I know, as the sender of an information piece, a sender of the communication, how do I know which channel I should choose? This depends on the characteristics of the communication. Very often students say importance of the message means that I should use a high richness communication channel. But that is not necessarily correct. I can communicate a very important message, a very urgent message, through text or through email. And so it is not necessarily the importance of the message that determines which channel we should choose. Rather, it's the complexity of the message. The more complex the message, the more likely it is to require follow-up exchange in terms of clarification questions. And so if I want to communicate a very complex message that is very likely to generate a need for questions, for follow-up, then I want to choose a high richness communication channel. Also, if the message has a very emotional component to it, if the message is concerning something that is very delicate or very important to the recipient of the communication, then I should err on a higher richness communication channel. If I choose a high richness communication channel for a complex message that is likely to require follow-up questions and a message that is very sensitive, I am more likely to avoid miscommunication. If I send such a message through a low richness communication channel like a letter or a memo, I am more likely to create a situation of miscommunication. So the right communication channel selection can also increase our chances of having effective communication and avoiding miscommunication. Of course, our ability to encode the message and communicate it verbally is extremely important to effective communication. But the recipient also plays a very important part in the communication process, and this happens through active listening. Active listening means that you are truly engaged in the conversation and truly seeking to understand what the sender is communicating. In order to listen actively, individuals need to stop talking themselves and make a conscious effort to hear what the sender is trying to tell us. We need to suspend judgment and wait to formulate a response. We should first take in the information before we are trying to formulate a response. We should also resist distractions, and that means maybe closing the office door, maybe turning away from the computer screen or turning it off altogether, maybe turning off our cellular phones or putting them away so that we are not distracted from the conversation that we are trying to engage in. We need to wait before we respond. Try to get more information by paraphrasing. For example, saying, "This is very interesting. Can you tell me more?" Or, "You say you are frustrated. Can you explain that?" This way, we can clearly communicate to the sender that we are truly listening and taking in the message that the sender wants to communicate to us. We seek important themes in what the communicator is trying to say, the sender of the information. We think a lot faster than we can speak. And so it is important for us to use that differential in trying to take in the information. Rather than focusing on a response, we should truly focus on listening actively. We can also communicate non-verbally that we are listening by making eye contact, nodding. Our body language can also communicate active listening. active listening is an important part of the effectiveness of the communication process, not just speaking.